The RTX 4090 has been out for about a week now, so it's high time I get started on my third-party reviews, and today I'm kicking that off with a review of the MSI Suprim Liquid X, as well as the Gigabyte Gaming OC variants of this graphics card. My goal is to show how these two coolers perform versus the Founders Edition, which I already covered, which uses this cooler, which has two fans and a pass-through, and notably is supposed to be available for the MSRP of $1,600 US if you can find it in stock. These two methods use air and water, so it's sort of an elemental battle here, with the Gigabyte Gaming OC representing the direction that a lot of add-in board manufacturers have gone with this card, which is a large cooler, as big as you can make it, 13.5 inches long on this one, with three fans, lots of aluminum fins, and copper heat pipes to keep all of the heat moving away from the GPU and out into the air around it. And then with MSI, you've got the Suprim Liquid X, which is simply attached a 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler to the GPU to see if water can cool this down a little bit more efficiently. So I'm testing two cards today, but I just wanted to point out that I have another RTX 4090 video coming soon that will follow up with some testing on the Asus Tough card that I also showed off in my unboxing video where I unboxed all these cards. And I had a late arrival from Colorful. This is the iGame Vulcan. It got held up in customs, so it arrived too late for the unboxing, but I will be testing those as well in a follow-up video. Don't want to get ahead of myself though. Let's get started on this one.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by the new FX series of cases and CPU coolers from Be Quiet, combining addressable RGB lighting with legendary build quality, top-tier performance, and near-silent operation. The Pure Base 500 FX can fit up to a 360mm all-in-one or tall air coolers while keeping things chilly thanks to airflow-optimized top and front panels. The Pure Loop 2 FX liquid cooler comes in three sizes and supports all modern mainstream CPUs, and the Pure Rock 2 FX air cooler can handle up to 150 watts TDP with style and ease. Be Quiet's FX series products are suitable for any build in need of a functional and tasteful RGB upgrade, so click the sponsor link in the video description for more. I'm going to start out with the Gigabyte Gaming OC, but one quick note before I get into it for my video today, as well as any videos that you're watching comparing various RTX 4090s against each other. When it comes to the GPU at the center of all of these RTX 4090s, you're dealing with basically the same chip. It's going to have the same CUDA core count, the same specifications that I went over in my launch review of the RTX 4090 Founders Edition. What's going to make these cards different from each other is going to be the design of the cooler itself, the design of the PCB, and possibly the components that go on top of that, possibly some extras that might be included like a dual VBIOS that you can switch between, or some stuff that might be included in the box like a GPU anti-sag support bracket. But the main thing for me that differentiates any one card from another is going to be performance, and that's not just going to be determined by the design choices of Gigabyte for the cooler that they've built, but also the quality of the GPU itself, and that varies from GPU to GPU. So even if you're looking at two of the exact same graphics cards from Gigabyte or MSI or Founders Edition cards, you might find slightly varying performance between those, so that's just something to keep in mind. The other major area of concern is going to be price, and for that we already know the Founders Edition costs $1,600, so how much more do these third-party versions cost, and is it worth it? Well, definitely you shouldn't be buying from someplace like Amazon where it's only being sold by a scalper marketplace reseller for $2,600. But both on Best Buy and on Newegg, this card is currently listing for $1,700, and that's a $100 markup over the Founders Edition. So that makes the question, is this card worth $100 more than the Founders Edition? Can you even find either of them in stock? Or should you opt for something like Gigabyte's Windforce or one of the other $1,600 cards, because each manufacturer does seem to have at least one of those, and if you're looking at a card like this versus an overclock card, you might only be getting a modest overclock with the OC variant anyway. This card, for example, in the gaming BIOS has a boost clock of 2,535 megahertz, which seems like a lot, but then you compare it to the Founders Edition, which is 2,520. You get a whole 15 megahertz overclock with this card out of the box compared to the Founders Edition or just the non-OC version. That said, this card does have something the Founders Edition doesn't, which is that VBIOS switch, which defaults to an OC or a silent mode, and I ran all my tests in the OC mode, by the way. But of course, you can also just flash either of those VBIOSes or adjust them and just have the advantage of two VBIOSes, which also gives you much more ease of mind if you want to tinker with that sort of thing, because if you happen to brick one of the VBIOSes, you can switch to the other one to reflash the original one or get yourself back up and running. You get a 4-year warranty, which is up 1 year from the 3-year warranty on the Founders Edition. It does require online registration. Beyond that, the cooler cooler is branded as one of Gigabyte's WindForce coolers, and it does have a fair amount of RGB integrated. You can control it with Gigabyte's RGB Fusion software, and then you also get some RGB accents in the Gigabyte logo here along the side, and you get a full metal backplate along the back, except for the part right here where the air is meant to pass through from that third cooling fan. Video outs remain the same as the Founders Edition, and the WindForce cooler has 3 110mm fans, as well as 10 composite copper heat pipes. Do note that the one in the middle spins the opposite direction as the ones on the outside, which Gigabyte claims to improve the cooling. It does have fan stop mode, so the fans won't spin at all when the GPU isn't hot enough. In terms of the cooler itself, it has a pretty sizable vapor chamber down here at the bottom, as well as a plate that extends out to provide some additional cooling for the VRAM. And of course, it maintains that pass-through cooling standard that NVIDIA has pretty much made standard across the board at this time. And I apologize for not having quite as much B-roll of like the lighting and stuff on this fan as I could. I was focused more on the performance, but I will include a link to this Gigabyte website where you can cycle through quite a few different RGB effects, and you can even go and like change the color that you want it to be and stuff like that. Oh, and I guess it also has a little light that indicates whether or not your 12 VH power is plugged in or not, which is also convenient. And now let's look at some card performance. I'm running Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K using the Ray Traced Ultra preset, and you can see the stats for the card on screen. The typical gaming fan speed that I was seeing without overclocking or anything like that was 76%, which did seem a little bit on the high side. That was about 1900 to 2100 RPM. However, this cooler is very quiet, as you'll see in my sound testing stats in just a moment, so we'll come back to that. The GPU clock speed was 2670 to 2730 megahertz, fluctuating just a little bit but staying pretty steady. GPU and memory temps were both in the mid-60s, so that's looking good, and the Ray Traced Ultra frame rate is 40 to 45 FPS, which isn't the best frame rate considering we're talking about the fastest graphics card available right now, but Cyberpunk 2077 is a pretty new game, and this is with all of the eye candy turned on to max at 4K. And we'll see if we can boost that with a little bit of overclocking in a moment, but the GPU power at stock was about 430 to 435 watts. I then dialed in an overclock. My fans were set to 80% speed, which is supposed to be a step up from the like 40 to 50% that most cards usually run at. It's actually only about a 5% improvement here, but that did lower temperatures some. We're at max power limit, 133%, plus 280 on the core clock, plus 1450 on the memory clock. That resulted in a 2815 megahertz boost setting on the GPU, and the memory at 1494. Now I used those overclock settings for the charts I'm going to show you in a few minutes here, but then when I actually went in for my more extended Cyberpunk playtest, I found I was encountering a little bit of instability, so I dialed it back slightly to plus 265 on the GPU core and plus 1425 on the memory. That resulted in Ray Traced Ultra performance of 2985 megahertz GPU clock speeds. Power draw definitely kicked up some to about 500 to 505 watts, and the frame rate increased only about 5 to 7 FPS, 45 to 52 FPS was what we were getting. Meanwhile, the GPU and memory temps were about the same, 65 to 68 degrees Celsius, and this is sort of offset by the fact that I increased the fan speed while also increasing the frequency, but I was still a little disappointed with that frame rate of 45 to 52 FPS, so I did one more pass with DLSS balanced mode enabled, and here the GPU clock speed actually increased to about 3000 megahertz. GPU power actually decreased to maybe 415 to 440 watts. Bear in mind that it's actually rendering the game at a lower resolution and then upscaling it, so that's part of the reason there. We did get a nice boost to frame rates to 90 to 95 FPS. Meanwhile, the GPU and memory temperatures further decreased to 58 to 62 degrees Celsius, and that's because we're running the same fan speeds but putting slightly less of load on those components. I do have some charts comparing the performance of both of these cards to the Founders Edition, which I will come to, but for now let's switch over to the MSI Suprim Liquid X RTX 4090, and the comment I've gotten most about this card, especially since I did the unboxing video, is that people really seem to appreciate the aesthetics, and I don't know if that's because thanks to the liquid cooling, MSI was able to fit this card in what seems to be a pretty sleek and svelte two-slot design, and this one with its brush metal finish, the attention to detail with the beveled edges around the outside, and the, I will say, tasteful RGB, since it does have accents down here with the chevron beside the integrated cooling fan, as well as on the new Suprim logo here on the back. They are RGB LEDs, but it defaults to white, and so it's given this card a little bit more of a classy feel, I'd say, than some of the super gamer cards that are out there. Of course, I'm sure you'll have to pay a hefty premium for the liquid cooling integration, operation on this card, and it's $1,750, a $150 markup over the Founders Edition or the base level 4090s, but $150 compared to, say, the Gigabyte card over here, which is $1,700, or for example, some of the Asus cards that are going for $1,800 or $2,000, is a nice indicator to me, relatively speaking of course, that this card isn't insanely overpriced thanks to the water cooling integration. And it is the same price over on Newegg as well, although they're both sold out. Aha, here's a nice exploded view of the pump cooler combo, the copper plate that is going to cool the GPU as well as the memory. And I actually have a point of criticism here that I'm going to get to in just a moment when we get to the temperatures, but also a point of criticism for myself. You might note that I'm not disassembling these cards today. Like I said, I'm doing a follow-up video, so if you guys have comments for me, let me know in the comment section whether you find a lot of value in the card teardowns or if looking at the design here on the manufacturer website is okay with you. I have a feeling I know what your answer is going to be, but I'm on a bit of a time crunch this week. Also, you might note with my overclocking, I did not increase the voltage, although that is something that you can do. So overclocks with these cards could push a little bit higher than I've shown you today. That said, here's a look at the microfin copper base, extra copper pieces along the side here that engage with the VRAM. And like the Gigabyte card, and honestly pretty much all cards these days, the fan won't spin if the GPU is not hot. I'm actually glad that MSI chose to use an active fan on the card itself to cool off the power delivery components, but there are, of course, two 120mm fans on the radiator, and they are MSI Meg Silent Gale P12 fans. And a few other notes on features like braided PVC tubes, which are decently long and I would say pretty flexible too, as far as the bit of use that I've been doing with it. And a couple notes on the power delivery components here. Advanced circuit layout with premium componentry, not to put too fine a point on it. And yes, again, we've got that gaming and silent dual V-BIOS setup right out of the box. I almost forgot to measure this card. Measuring from the bracket, it is actually just shy of 11 inches long. So again, in terms of compatibility with cases, especially maybe smaller cases, you might have an easier time integrating this card versus one of the cards that are 13 inches long or longer. However, you also need to have space for this 240mm radiator, and I will say that this rad gets quite hot while this card is in use. I can feel it just emanating heat from the outside, so I wouldn't put this as an intake in a case, because you'll be dumping all that heat into your case and affecting the temperature of other components like your CPU and memory. In terms of gaming performance, while running Cyberpunk 2077 with the same settings as the Gigabyte card, we had a typical fan speed after a 15 to 20 minute test of about 37%. That's 1300 to 1400 RPMs as measured by Hardware Info, and the GPU clock was running at 2745 megahertz, maybe peaking at 2775 megahertz. GPU temps were nice and cool thanks to the liquid cooler, about 55 to 58 degrees Celsius, roughly 10 degrees lower than the Gigabyte card, but the memory temp was not looking quite so good. It was actually hitting 86 degrees Celsius, so we'll keep an eye on that. 40 to 45 frames per second, ray traced ultra 4K gaming here, and the GPU power draw was around 430 to 435 watts. From there, I dialed in an overclock once again, 80% fan speed, which was a pretty significant increase over what it was running at stock. The power limit on this card only goes up to 110%, so that was slightly disappointing. I couldn't crank it up to 133% to get to the full 600 watt power limit that the 12VH power connector provides. Did plus 205 on the core clock, leading to a 2830 megahertz boost clock, and plus 1315 on the memory, which put it at 1477 megahertz. Again, I used those settings to run 3D Mark and the integrated benchmark in Cyberpunk, and then when I tried to do the lengthier test, I ran into a little bit of instability, so again I dialed it back just slightly to plus 200 on the core and plus 1300 on the memory. Here is the ray traced ultra performance with that overclock dialed in. We were hitting about 3015 megahertz clock speed on the GPU, about 490 to 500 watts in terms of GPU power draw, and getting about 45 to 52 frames per second. The GPU was at 51 to 55 degrees Celsius, so it actually cooled off a bit thanks to increasing those fan speeds, but the memory again was running a little bit warmer than I would like. 78 to 80 degrees Celsius is just fine in terms of how hot GDDR6X memory can get and can run at comfortably. It's just notably warmer than the Gigabyte card and the Founders Edition. Finally, once again switched over to DLSS balance mode. Here the clock speed remained the same at about 3015 megahertz. GPU power went down yet again, 440 to 460 watts, and the frame rate went up. Not quite as much as with the Gigabyte card. I was getting about 75 to 90 FPS. The GPU temperature was 50 to 53 degrees degrees Celsius, and the memory again cooled off just a little bit down to 76 degrees. And now for some side-by-side comparisons along with the Founders Edition. I did do an overclock setting with the Founders Edition card as well. At stock, the Founders Edition typically runs at a fan speed of about 46% or 1500 RPMs. For the overclock, I cranked that up to 70% fan speed, 133% power limit, plus 275 on the core clock, plus 1400 on the memory clock, 2795 megahertz boost, 1488 megahertz on the memory. And you can see those clock speed results from the overclocks and the stock settings right here. The Founders Edition hit 3045 megahertz peak clock, but it was running at about 3015 megahertz on average during the gaming test. And here are the results from those in terms of temperatures. And if you're looking at these and thinking, Paul, why are your overclocked temperatures lower than your not overclocked temperatures? Remember, the first thing you will often do when you're overclocking a graphics card is increase the fan speed to lower temperatures and get yourself higher clock speeds. And I think in particular, since I wasn't adding any more voltage, the increased fan speeds was resulting in lower temperatures overall, while I was also getting more performance. Of course, it also resulted in a little bit more noise. But whether you're looking at the stock or the overclocked numbers, you can see that both the Gigabyte card and the MSI card are running cooler. Specifically, if you're looking at the GPU temperatures, it was really just the MSI Liquid X's memory temperatures that were a little bit warm for my taste. That said, 86 to 88 degrees Celsius is still well within the operating range for GDDR6X memory, and it's definitely not getting up to 95, 100, or 105 or beyond, which is what a lot of the RTX 3090 Founders Edition cards were notorious for doing. Here's a look at power draw numbers, and you can see that there is a slight creep up in terms of power draw when it comes to the Gigabyte and the MSI cards. Remember that the MSI card is running a pump as well as larger size fans, so that's probably where the stock power draw increase is coming from. But I did see more than a 100 watt increase in the Gigabyte and Founders Edition cards when I overclocked. Not quite so much with the MSI card, but this is part of the reason why the cards ship at the clock speeds that they do. They could run a little bit faster, but there's a big trade-off in terms of power draw and then eventually temperatures, so that's why they typically ship with more conservative clock speeds. Here's a look at fan noise, and we're not looking at stock versus overclocked. I just set the fans to a fixed 40%, 70%, and 100% fan speed. Please bear in mind that my office here is actually not the best environment for testing audio. The noise floor is a little bit loud at about 41 dBA, so I actually wasn't able to get readings for 40% fan speeds for either the Gigabyte or the MSI cards. Founders Edition got up to 46.2 dBA at 40% speed. The Gigabyte RTX 4090 Gaming OC was actually the quietest card that I tested based on these parameters, so good job Gigabyte on the design of your card and the choice of your fans. Finally, here's 3D Mark Times by Extreme just to show the difference in performance when I did the overclock versus non-overclock, as well as stock performance, and you can see a slight variance here. If you're looking at the non-overclocked numbers, it is good to know at least that the Gigabyte card scores a little bit more right out of the box, and then the MSI card outperforms that even a little bit more, which I was kind of expecting since it is a card with a liquid cooler attached. That said, when overclocked, the gap narrowed between all the cards. They all broke 19,000 in terms of graphics score. The MSI card still won with a 19,194, but we're only looking at less than a 200-point gap between all three cards. Finally, here's Cyberpunk 2077 running at 4K. This is with the Ultra preset, but with ray tracing and DLSS turned off so we can get raw comparative numbers. And here again, we can see a slight performance advantage for the MSI card at stock. And again, maybe a frame or two more from the Gigabyte card and then the MSI card when we were running with those overclock settings. So here's where you make the real world decision. Is it worth it to have an extra 100 plus watts of power draw for a difference of maybe 3 or 4 FPS in actual gaming performance? So those are my test results for these three cards, and now to summarize, I think the Founders Edition is actually a very tough card to beat. And as a lot of people have been pointing out, NVIDIA is making it more and more challenging for their add-in board partners to stand out with their card designs because of what they've been doing with the Founders Edition. Now, if NVIDIA was still charging a premium for the Founders Edition like they did when they first introduced it, however many generations ago that was, then it would be easier for board partners to stand out offering a value proposition with their sort of entry-level $1,600-ish cards in this instance. But since the Founders Edition also costs $1,600, we have to decide if a $100, $150, or $200 or more price premium is worth it over the Founders Edition, and I would say it's probably not, but you're probably right now at least dealing with more of a situation where you can't get this card, and so you're maybe looking for others that are out there. So that is my number one point of analysis that I'm coming away from this video with all due respect and apologies to MSI and Gigabyte. That said, if we're ignoring that value proposition question and we're just judging these based on performance, you are getting slightly more performance in terms of thermals and in terms of noise generation with the Gigabyte card and the MSI card. Neither card stood out significantly in terms of overclocking performance, which was kind of expected. Like I said, the GPUs inside all of these cards are all going to operate within some variants of one another, and it's kind of luck of the draw in terms of if you get a good overclocking chip or not. But I do appreciate the actual functional value add-ons that these cards are bringing, even if that mostly boils down to a dual VBIOS switch. So between these two cards, again, if we're ignoring the bargain-priced $1,600 Founders Edition, I think the Gigabyte card does a great job of, well, taking up a lot of space, but actually making use of that space by having a big cooler that does a very effective job, while also pairing it with fans that can move a lot of air and keep the temperatures down, even if they are spinning at a higher percentage RPM out of the gate. And yes, again, it gets bonus points for being a little bit cooler and a little bit quieter than the Founders Edition. The MSI card here, I think, is a little bit more niche just because of the liquid cooling aspect. It is running cooler on the GPU, but hotter on the memory. And it does have the prospect of being able to fit in some cases or some builds that some other cards simply cannot, simply because it is a 2-slot design with a smaller card itself. But of course, you gotta have room for the cooler too. Now, the one thing that stood out to me while I was testing this card that I don't have an answer for you guys on yet is, like I said, this radiator gets really, really hot when it's under use. And I've had issues in the past with all-in-one cooler pumps failing when the liquid temperature runs too hot for too long. So I reached out to MSI to ask them if there's any way to monitor the liquid temperature in this loop to sort of keep an eye on that, especially if you're doing lengthy extended gaming sessions. I didn't give them a whole lot of time, but if they provided a response, I'll post something on the screen right now. But I think that is all that I have to say about these cards right now. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I will be coming back with another RTX 4090 testing video to test the Asus card and the colorful iGame Vulkan. So if you guys have any suggestions or feedback for me for that video, or if there's anything you'd like me to revisit for these cards, since I'll be showing performance comparisons there, then do leave those in the comment section down below. In the meantime, I'll post links to these cards in the description. They're probably still sold out, but hopefully there's more of them coming back into stock soon. But also down there, I'll post a link to my store at paulshardware.net, where you can help support my channel by buying yourself some super awesome merch. It's all very high quality, and you can also check out my new 8-bit designs, which are super cool. If you guys enjoyed this video, definitely hit the thumbs up button on your way out and let me know. And also, of course, comments in the comment section down below are always appreciated. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.